Kendra James is the first Black legacy student to graduate from the prestigious prep school Taft. In a gripping new book about race and class, Kendra looks back at the 3 years she spent at this boarding school in Connecticut. Described as a must-read for anyone that has ever been the only one in an all-white environment, Admissions lays bare the whiteness of elite boarding schools. Kendra joins me coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Kendra James is the author of Admissions, a memoir of surviving boarding school. Good morning and congratulations, Kendra, on your new book.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me to talk about it today.
Wow. So Admissions is about, I was trying to find it, I have it right here. I was like, where did I do my copy? I'm just so fascinated with the cover art. How did you and your editor and your agent or all the folks involved, come up with students, looks like a typical class picture, but it's not. Yep. It has, color dots on the faces. What was this about?
Yeah, so that is actually about a third of our full class photo from our senior year, which is taken like a few nights before graduation. That's actually like literally an hour after that picture was taken. I had a wild allergic reaction to some shellfish and spent the night in the infirmary. And some people thought I had been drinking, but no, I was just throwing up because I couldn't have shrimp. But yeah, so that picture.
Well, wait a minute. So are you on here? Because
so that's literally the only uncovered face. That is me.
That's you.
And so that is a real picture of part of my class. And we went through like a few cover choices. There was one that was like just me, very big on the cover. I'm not so into that, just personally. I don't need to be splashed across everywhere. But we really felt like that image really conveyed the sort of environment that Black and brown kids found themselves in for however long they were attending Taft.
So I assume you had to get permission from everyone that was in this photograph to use their likeness and their image for your book?
No, so because we covered them up and because it was 2006 and like every man is wearing a pair of khakis or chinos and like every girl is wearing that same like dress that was so popular in 2006, because we covered their faces and it was just so generic.
So it's really not their likeness and image. Okay, because you're right. Okay, that's...
Yeah, so I did get, I actually, funnily enough, got an Instagram message last night from someone who's coming out to see one of the events on my upcoming book tour, and their husband went to Taft, and they said to me, like, yeah, he went through and identified like everyone for her who was in those images. But yeah, no, the only permission that we had to get was from the photographer at the school who took it. Right.
Okay. So you didn't have to call them to say, I'm going to put your picture on the cover of my book.
Yeah.
But they have, many of them, I assume, have gotten the book. How did they react, if at all, to, having a dot on their faces? Because anyone, if I'm in this picture, of course, I know who I am, right? So I don't know the people because I don't know your class. But if this were my class picture, I could say, that's me because I wore that green dress and that's my hair, blah, blah, blah. So have you gotten any reaction from your classmates saying anything about this photo?
Not the photo itself, but I definitely have gotten reactions from classmates just like about the book in general. And they've all been, and I did get reactions from the head of school as well. And they have actually all been very kind, just in terms of like, saying we understand, like we as young people, this is the students specifically, but like we as young people did not realize or always see like what was going on and what the divides were on campus. A lot of like, thank you for opening my eyes to help me see what was happening and help me see what is still happening, unfortunately, on a lot of these campuses. And then also like some really interesting feedback that I got that I do like to share is that even from white students, like I got quite a few messages from white Jewish students who a lot of them said like, obviously we don't want to directly correlate the struggles of being, you know, a very visibly Black person on campus with what I went through, but like for a Jewish kid on campus, it was also pretty rough because we were not like specifically a religious school and we weren't specifically a Christian school, but there were a lot of like Christian underpinnings to like, you know, what we did. And so they also felt like outsiders. And I've heard from them saying like, thank you for sort of illuminating some of this struggle.
So set the stage for us. For folks who really, you know, don't have a good clue or, you know, good sense about what these elite boarding schools are like, you know, just give us a visual of TAF.
Yeah. When I used to work in admissions myself, in school admissions after I graduated from college, I would always say it is a country club for high schoolers, essentially. And like we are there to learn. We're there to do rigorous academic work. But at the same time, we were also on a campus that had 2 ice rinks, access to stables. We had perfectly manicured fields. We had state-of-the-art theatrical and dance facilities. At the time, I want to say tuition was between like $35,000 and $40,000. This upcoming year, I believe it's something like $66,000. And you can see that money in work on campus. And so you arrive on campus, and especially if you're not used to being in elite spaces like that, it can feel very overwhelming, especially just like walking into, they just redid the dining hall a few years ago, and walking in and just seeing the vaulted wood ceilings and the light coming in, and just it looks every bit of what you're paying for it.
So I know, Kendra, that your dad actually was a student at TAF, and now at some point, maybe still now, was on the board of trustees. So given that, did you have an opportunity to visit the school or have any affiliation with the school, you know, even before you became a student?
Oh, like completely. I've been going up to that school for like alumni weekends or like special sport event weekends since I was like 2 or 3. So I was very familiar with being up there. I wasn't necessarily like very social or anything. I remember like on a lot of those alumni weekends, they would have a separate area for kids to like all the kids of the alumni to hang together. And I was usually doing the same thing that I would be doing at family gatherings, which is like sitting in the corner and reading a book. So I was definitely like very around the school. There was a point in middle school in either 6th or 7th grade where I did a really early admissions interview with the head of admissions, who at the time, Mr. Wandelt, who had also been working in admissions when my dad was at the school in the 70s. Okay. And then in like 8th grade, I went up and did an overnight visit. I stayed with 2, I think they were Black sophomores at the time, and went to classes with them, slept in the dorms. And then I didn't apply for my freshman year. I started the school in my sophomore year. But yeah, I had been up there quite a lot. I went up for like the dedication of the new ice rink in 2001, which I think was also the same year that my dad started his term as a trustee. So yeah, I was very familiar with the school, and I knew a lot of people.
So was it a childhood dream of yours to become a student at TAF, since you were going back to alumni weekends, you were going back with your dad? I assume your dad was probably pretty popular, you know, well respected because he's a graduate and now he's giving back and serving on the board of trustees. So were you growing up thinking, Kendra, the high school student, you know, this is where I want to spend my high school years?
It was definitely part of the plan. I think like from a young age, it was sort of, I knew that is where my parents kind of wanted me to go. I grew up in a really small town in a New Jersey suburb. And so I had been going to school with the same people basically since I was in preschool, kindergarten. And my mom only just sold our childhood home. So like I grew up in the same house. Everything was very consistent. And so especially coming off of middle school, which like is a rough time for anyone, that part of adolescence, I really wanted to do my freshman year with my group of friends who I'd been with just for so long at that point. Some of them were neighbors that I could like easily walk to. We spent all of our times during the summers together. Like sleepaway camp wasn't a huge thing in my group of friends. And so, yeah, I wanted to do my freshman year with them. And also my parents thought that I like wasn't quite baked enough yet, so to say, in terms of like they wanted to see like a little bit more maturity before they sent me off to live by myself, essentially. But yeah, so it was definitely part of the plan. And I wasn't blind. Like I could see the differences between my local high school in Maplewood, which is a very good school. It's Columbia High School. Like we graduated Lauren Hill, Zach Kraft is Ellen Powell, many like very accomplished people.
Help us understand for those people who, you know, maybe thinking, why does a family send off a 14-year-old, maybe a 15-year-old to live, as you just said, on a country club where essentially the school administration becomes the parents and not just the teachers? Because, you know, if you go to a traditional high school, you go from 9 to 3 or 8 to 3 and you go home and your parents parent you. But if you go away to boarding school, I mean, you're there, you live there, you're on, you know, 24/7 with these adults who take on the role of your parents. So help people understand, like, why would, you know, parents that love their kids do that?
Yeah, it's funny, originally, like when I was pitching the book around, it was under the title, Yes, My Parents Loved Me, and other questions that I've gotten about boarding school. But yeah, we changed that. But yeah, no, there's different reasons for every family, I think. For me, like it was definitely partially was the direct connection that we already had to PATH. And I was very unusual too in my application process. You don't just apply to one school. That's not something that you do if you are trying to get into an independent school. You have to apply to a bunch and then see where you get in. I only applied to one, and I think like my dad was just very confident that I was going to get in as a legacy. So that was part of it. And also like the school system that I grew up in, we did a leveling system. So the so-called like less intelligent kids were in level 2. You could be in 3 or 4 and then AP classes. Now, obviously that gets really segregated really easily. So the school system was a little racist as well. I also was a big athlete. I was a figure skater and I played softball. And so there were just advantages to going away to a school with better facility for me.
Well, the fact that you were the first legacy student, Black student, right? First legacy Black student?
Black American, yeah.
Okay, Black American, says that the other Black Americans that were there with your dad didn't send their kids there. So what do you make of that? Because you wouldn't have been the first legacy Black student if the other parents that had gone there said, this is so great, you know, I'm going to send little Billy or little Mary to TAFT.
Yeah, it's funny because the first guy who did go there, he was from, I want to say Barbados. And he's a Barbadian, and he did send his granddaughter there in the 80s, which ended up, she still counts as a legacy. But if you read an interview from him in our alumni magazine, he calls TAFT the loneliest, like 3 of the loneliest years of his life. And I was not necessarily lonely at TAFT. I had a very like strong group of friends. But as an alumni and now someone with like perspective, and especially someone who then like I went to a college that was the complete opposite of TAFT in terms of like culture and population. It like as an alumni, I'm now dealing with the same thing where it's like I know I probably wouldn't send my kids to boarding school in general because of that parenting thing that you were talking about, which we refer to as in loco parentis. It's really hard as like a Black adult in America to like want to trust the parenting of your Black or brown child to a group that is majority white.
Did you have any Black teachers or administrators or people who were serving in this, you know, surrogate parental role while you were there?
Yeah, so we had the director of diversity was of course a Black woman, and then we had 2 other Black teachers on staff. One was a French teacher, and she was a woman somewhere from the continent of Africa. I don't know which country she was from. But and then we had a history teacher who showed up, I believe, either my senior or my junior year. So we had those two, and our the director of diversity, like I always say, she really was like a second mother to a lot of us. She had two young daughters herself, and they lived on campus, and she was always the person who would like either drive people to get their hair done, or like she would cook like home cooked meals for us. She would provide money to us by like letting us babysit her kids. She was always she was always just like a person we could go to.
So I know you said you didn't experience loneliness like the other alumni, the Barbadian, but you did have some clashes. Tell us about the clashes that you had with white students. You described them in the book.
Yeah, so I write about two big incidents in admissions, and the first one was for my sophomore year. I had a white roommate who I always, now when I was writing the book, the show wasn't out, but I have a perfect comparison. The families on that HBO show, The Gilded Age, she's one of those families, like literally.
Which family? It's one of my favorite shows.
Can't say, but like of that ilk, that is her family. Okay. So the two of us we were paired together. And I had a lot of like fantasies about going to boarding school because I was growing up in that era of like Harry Potter, you know. I was really looking forward to sort of like the magical adventure of having a roommate and becoming best friends for life, essentially. And that did not happen with us. And everything sort of came to a head where one day our sleeping schedules just didn't match. I was either getting up early to go to ice skating lessons, or I was getting up early to like try and figure out my hair. And I remember one day she told me that she would always complain about the smell of my hair products and like the smell of like me trying to flat iron my perm down, all of that stuff. And then also like the final straw was like one day she told me, just because you're Black doesn't mean you have to get up early to do your hair. And I was like, well, actually it literally kind of does. Especially like to then try to conform to the dress code of this like majority white school, like actually, yes, it does mean that. And I told my friends about that, my Black friends, and they were like, well, that's racist, what she said. And that's not something that at the time I would have categorized racist, because like back then that word really, at least in my understanding, it really meant those big things, you know, like big civil rights.
We're talking about microaggressions and things like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. But they were like, you got to do something about that. And so, yeah, we basically pretended to be witches. We set up like we drew a pentacle on the ground in chalk, and like we set candles up all over the room just to try to scare her. When she got back from field hockey practice one day, and it worked. She was no longer my roommate after that.
She requested to be assigned, huh?
Yes. So that was one incident. And then the second incident was also my sophomore year, where I was accused by a white passing student of stealing money from her dorm room. And it was this whole thing over $20. She accused me of stealing it from her, and I said that I had not, but she proceeded to say that she had a relative in the police department that she was basically going to send prints to, which was like, looking back, it's like, this is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous.
You've been watching forensic files or something. She's like, I got your prints, I'm going to send them to a lab, and I'm going to be able to identify you. Now, did you fall for that as a high school student?
I absolutely did, because so Taft ran on an honor code, and they took the honor code very seriously. And it basically, the way it was set up was, if it was kind of assumed that you had done the thing that you were accused of, certainly you could deny it. But if it was then still found that like the honor court or whoever the adult was in the situation thought that you had still done what you were accused of, you denying it was the second strike, because that counted as a lie, and lying was against honor code. And so I got pulled into an administrator's office to talk about this scenario, and I could tell like he was talking about it as if like I had done that. Mm-hmm. And he mentioned that like she was like finding evidence, and that she was like sending evidence out. and like while I was writing the book, like a lot of things occurred to me that, because it's not something I think about very often or had not prior.
That experience caused you to just fess up to something you had not done?
Yeah, because I did the calculation in my head of like, okay, I cannot, like, I think every.
Let me ask you this. I'm sitting here thinking, as a mother, here you are, a teenager, being confronted by this administrator who's pretty much pressuring you to admit you did something that you didn't do. Can you call your mother? Like, can you get your parents on the phone and say, like, look, I need my own parents here. I need some support here.
That, it's so funny because it happened on like a Wednesday or a Thursday, and there was a parents' weekend that weekend. So my parents were coming up anyway. But the way, because I think every Black kid goes through this, where like you don't want to embarrass your family when you're in some sort of like elevated space, and you're the only one. And he was just presenting it in such a way where it was like, you did this, and there were phrases being put out like, well, if you just admit what you did, like, you'll get this suspension instead of being fully expelled. And when you're at a school like this, like the idea of being expelled is like the end of the world, like having to go back to your public school kind of in shame. Or like, if you're like a wealthy white kid, your parents are just going to find another school to put you in because they can full pay. But yeah, the idea of being expelled was just like kind of unthinkable to me. And so the calculation was like, I can say that I did this. And one positive thing about Taft is that like they do say, like, if you admit to what you did and you serve your punishment, like all is forgiven and forgotten. Like you've learned your lesson and we don't hold that against you. And that really did happen. Like I admitted it. My parents were pissed. I went home for a week and served my suspension. And then like no one at Taft ever brought it up again until it was like, unless it was during my college application process where like my college counselor said, you're going to have to write like a little statement about what you did. And that statement, I reread it back in the time since. And I used to write a lot of fan fiction and I used to like do a lot of writing online. And I can tell what character from which character perspective I wrote that letter, because it was not mine.
Yeah, there's another really jarring incident that happens that you describe in the book, and that's this newspaper article that comes out by a white student in the school newspaper accusing the Black and Latin students of being racist and of segregating themselves and of expecting that they, were deserving of more. And I think what was so jarring for me about that experience was the way the Black kids handled it, that you described the Black kids being in this kind of, meeting, this room that they've convened, this meeting room, trying to figure out how to respond to this. Again, as teenagers, not having access to your parents and trying to figure out how do you deal with being called racist. How difficult was it for you to relive that incident?
It's funny, that incident I've thought of more in my time since graduating, if only because the person who wrote that article, the white girl who wrote it, it's always stuck with me that she never had to face consequence for it, because that's kind of what we were trying to do in that room. We were trying to think like, okay, we know she's not going to get in trouble like with like the honor code system or anything, but it was kind of us being like, how can we respond? What can we do? And the solution that we came up with was we wanted to have a community meeting in one of the theaters and just sort of like invite her to have a dialogue about like what she thought she was doing with that article, and then like us sort of giving her some feedback. And she chose not to show up, and no teacher required her to. And yeah, so that one's always stuck with me, and it sticks with me because she went on to become a journalist who worked in the Middle East. So I always like kind of think to myself like, well, I hope your perspective has changed a little bit, and I hope that you have learned something since then.
Yeah, I think what really stuck out for me was where you say, here we are, 10 children in a room surrounded by whiteness, attempting to solve the racism of a 115-year-old institution.
Yeah,
I think that's a powerful.
That's yeah.
Yeah, that really resonated with me. I know, Kendra, you went on to become an admissions director yourself, and at some point you said, I can't keep selling this lie. What were the lies that you felt like you were selling to parents?
Yeah, so I started my admissions career after college at a organization that I was familiar with because they had sent a lot of kids to Taft, and a lot of my friends had come out of this organization. And it was an organization that took kids in New York City out of public school, low income, and students of color out of public school and placed them in independent schools in the New York, New Jersey area, and then also in the boarding schools in New England. And that program specifically, while I was working there, I was sort of the person who would get up during the meeting speeches and talk about the advantages and the positive experiences of going there, of going to one of these schools, and talking about how, like, you know, these aren't lies, like they really do open doors. I know that, like, living in LA now, it's really convenient when, like, you're in a meeting in the entertainment industry with like an older white dude, and he's like, well, my kid's at Milton right now. And you can be like, oh, right, I'm familiar with Milton. I played sports there when I was at Taft. So all of those sort of like really positive things I was up there espousing, but the program did not really talk about or was not honest enough about what that transition is really like for low income students of color, and just like sort of like the social, just like the genuine like social things that you're going to run into, like when you go to a party, when you're invited to a party on Saturday night, and you come up from Brooklyn and you realize slowly that you're going to like 84th and Central Park West, and then you enter the building and you realize you're in the penthouse, and this is like something completely different than what you are going home to. And it's just like little experiences like that, or like kids talking about vacations and they're going to, you know, Antarctica for 2 weeks, and it's like a $25,000, like all of these things. And then yeah, just the fact that there will be other Black.
At some point you said, I don't want to stand up and tell parents that this environment is going to be healthy, when you feel like there were things about it that weren't healthy.
Yeah, no, completely. Like just even the fact that, like, yes, there are other Black and brown students, absolutely, but it's going to be like that group of 25 of you is not enough to sort of overwhelm the larger school population. I just didn't think we were honest about how that could make you feel and how that could do damage going forward.
What do you hope the book does in terms of dispelling any myths that people may have about boarding schools?
I think because the image of boarding schools and independent schools is like so derived from, again, like your Harry Potters, your Gossip Girls, stuff like that. And I really hope that it gives people a more honest look into not only what it's like to be a Black student there, but I hope that like white students who are currently or recently graduated from these schools can read it and understand, like, oh, when I'm in touch with my alumni office, or when the school is doing reach out for me, these are things that I should be mentioning in like feedback. And I should be looking back at my own experiences and seeing how I might have played into this sort of repetitive cycle, or the cyclical cycle of racism and just general race issues on campus, because they are very cyclical.
And what do you think the administration, you said that the response has been positive from the Taft administration. Is there anything you want them to change now that you've written this book and you've exposed what your experiences were?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of DEI work happening right now. Like, literally got an email about 10 minutes before we started about sort of the stuff that they have already done since their last review. I think a lot of schools too, it should be mentioned, did or were pushed into a large-scale review of their Black and brown students' experiences after June of 2020. Because of George Floyd and the Black Squares, and also a lot of accounts started on Instagram called Black at. And so you could basically put Black at insert independent school here and find just troves of decades worth of bad experiences that Black kids had at these schools, and literally decades worth of them. And so Taft had one of those accounts, and out of that was sort of born a lot of DEI work. And I think that they are very much attempting in good faith to improve the experiences of future students of color. I think that the freshman class coming in this year is going to have a better experience than I did. I do think absolutely, but I've also seen, again, like these incidents are very cyclical. That article that we just talked about, I found a very, like almost like beat for beat, same article written in the winter of 2017 in the school paper. Okay. So it repeats.
So is this book written for parents who may be thinking about boarding school? Is it written for students who are at boarding schools? Is it written for admissions officers? So who's the best, who do you to read this?
I think that if you're sending your kid, especially if you're a parent of color and you're considering sending your kid to a boarding school, you should read this. Obviously, like the experiences are from the years 2003 to 2006. So things have changed, but I think that it is an in-depth look at some of the things that your kids might experience. And then I tried to write it in a way, YA memoir does not sell, so I could not write a YA memoir, but I did try to write it in a manner that it would feel acceptable to like a strong 8th grade reader, and certainly anyone in high school can pick this up and read it.
So I know the book starts with a glossary. Why was that important? I mean, you have all these terms, and I kind of saw that as another way of you showing just how clubby and how insular these kinds of prep schools are. Like you have your own language, and you got to be able to know the language to even fit in.
Yeah, that was absolutely part of it. I wanted to get like at that kind of like elite country club feel. But then also there's like that map. And so part of it, I wanted it to feel, because again, boarding schools have such like a fantastical reputation in pop culture. I wanted it to feel a little bit like you were entering a bit of a fantasy world. So hence the map and the glossary.
Right. Okay. Well, I know after leaving, you've done some amazing things. You work with Shondaland.com. What's next for Kendra?
Yeah, so I moved out to LA after my education career, and I was a founding editor of Shondaland.com, and then I moved over to be the managing editor of Star Trek. But right now I'm actually the executive producer of culture and entertainment podcast at Crooked Media. So I'm having a lot of fun doing that, still doing like continuing on sort of the social justice work that I feel like admissions was doing, but on a much wider scale, producing podcasts.
Yeah. So is there a, admissions part 2 in the making?
Not part 2, but I will say, I can't really say anything official, but like I can say that my amazing agency and publisher are working really hard to make sure that admissions has like a second life.
Okay. Well, wonderful. Well, good luck to you. It's an amazing book, and I hope, like you said, parents read it, kids who are in high school who may be thinking about boarding school, folks who work in admissions obviously need to read Admissions, a memoir of surviving boarding school. My best to you, and thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, what an amazing book by a young woman who was, courageous enough to look back at her high school years and to share them in the book Admissions, a memoir of surviving boarding school. Kendra James obviously has a bright future ahead of her. She worked with Shondaland.com, which is an amazing entertainment company. Now she's doing some things in the entertainment industry with podcasts. And she says there's probably a second life for Admissions. I don't know if that's a movie, a series, maybe another book. But again, I just want to give her a lot of kudos for sharing these experiences and helping people that may not know what it's like to be at one of these elite boarding schools. And, again, for me as a parent, I can't really wrap my brains around sending my kids off to that kind of environment, although I do have some good friends whose kids are in boarding school now, and they are having an awesome experience. So, parents have to make decisions about their kids based on their own families and their own experiences. But I'm just happy that Kendra shared this. I think as I think about the words to live by, the thing that comes to mind for me is that all that glitters ain't gold. So if you are thinking about sending your kid to one of these prep schools that have skating rinks and tennis courts and horse stables, just make sure that, the environment is going to be nurturing and supportive. Kind of makes me cringe thinking about these 15-year-olds having to navigate race and issues of institutional racism without the support of their parents and not the ability to, converse with their parents in real time. So boarding schools, do better. I think that's one of the messages Kendra wanted to convey. And parents, my message to you is do your due diligence. This might be the best choice for your kid, but it may not. Be safe out there. And remember, we're all in this together.